The night Ella found him was one of those evenings that makes the whole world feel tilted. The rain had turned the city's sidewalks into mirrors, reflecting blurred lights and restless colors. She had stayed late at the small publishing office where she worked, finishing the last of her edits while a storm murmured against the glass. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. But the air still felt heavy with something unspoken. Ella pulled her coat tighter and walked with quick steps, half lost in her own thoughts. She had been replaying the same worry in her mind for weeks. Her life felt like a string of repetitive days with no spark, no surprise, nothing meaningful enough to shake her awake. She had become accustomed to predictability. It made her feel safe, but it also made her feel strangely invisible in her own life. Then she saw him dotted first. She thought the street lamp was flickering, but it wasn't the lamp. It was a man sitting beneath it still, composed, unlike the hurried shapes of everyone else rushing past. His presence under that dim yellow glow was almost unsettling in its quietness. He didn't blend with the street, nor did he look like someone waiting for help. He had the calmness of someone who had learned how to endure. Ella slowed her steps before she even realized she had done it. The man's hair was long and pulled into a low tie, rain-darkened and heavy. His face was striking in a way that wasn't about beauty so much as intensity-high cheekbones, a sharp jaw, and eyes that watched the street with a depth that tugged at her. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed to the point of collapse. Yet he didn't hold a sign. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't even look at the people passing by, as if he wasn't expecting the world to notice him. Something inside her stirred an instinct she couldn't explain. Ella had always been careful. Her friends teased her for being the cautious one, the planner, the woman who never took unnecessary risks. She wasn't the type to pause for a stranger sitting alone at night. But something about him cut straight through her usual rules. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in his posture. Maybe it was the way he held himself like someone who had known strength but had been battered by something greater. Maybe it was simply the look in his eyes, deep, watchful, old pain wrapped in stillness. Before she could stop herself, she walked closer. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, keeping her distance but unable to ignore the weight that had settled in her chest. She expected him to turn away or to ignore her the way many people on the street kept to themselves. But instead, he lifted his head and looked at her fully. His eyes were a dark, rich brown, so deep they almost appeared black. And inside them was something she had never seen in a stranger before, a storm held tight behind control. He studied her for a moment, not with suspicion but with an odd calm, as if he was gauging whether she was real or just a kind illusion created by the night. "I'm fine," he said at last, his voice low and rasped, as though he hadn't used it in hours. But Ella could tell he wasn't fine. His clothes were soaked. His hands were trembling slightly, though he kept them hidden in his sleeves. Everything about him spoke of exhaustion carried over too many days. "You look cold," she murmured before she could stop herself. He gave a faint, weary smile that made something twist in her stomach. "It's nothing I haven't handled before." That should have been the end. She should have nodded and walked away. But the thought of leaving him there alone, wet, exhausted, felt wrong in a way she couldn't shake. "Can I get you something warm to eat?" she asked softly, his brows lifted in surprise. For a second, he looked away, jaw tightening with a mix of pride and hesitation. He wasn't used to kindness. She could see that instantly. "I'm Ella," she added, trying to make the moment less intimidating. He exhaled, slow and reluctant. "Talon." The name washed over her like a shiver, strong, unusual, a name with history in it, and in that small exchange beneath the flickering street lamp, something shifted, not something loud or dramatic, but something quiet and life-changing. Ella didn't know it yet, but the moment she offered him warmth, She wasn't bringing a stranger into her world. She was opening the door to everything. Her life had been missing. The walk to her apartment was only 6 blocks, but it felt longer stretched by the strange, fragile silence between them. Talon walked a few steps behind her, not because she asked him to, but because he seemed unsure of how close he was allowed to be. Every movement he made was controlled, deliberate, as if he was trying not to take up more space than necessary. Ella kept glancing back to make sure he was still following. Each time, she found him watching the ground, shoulders tense beneath the wet fabric of his coat. He moved with the careful steps of someone who had been carrying his life in a single bag for too long. "You don't have to stay if you're uncomfortable," Ella said as they reached her street. She wasn't sure why she said it, maybe to give him an escape, or maybe to reassure him that she wasn't expecting anything dramatic from him. She had no idea what she was expecting, only that the thought of him turning around and disappearing back into the rainy night felt wrong. Talon lifted his eyes, and just that small shift felt like the world briefly held its breath. "I'm not uncomfortable," he said quietly. "Just not used to this." "Used to what?" she asked gently. "People noticing I exist." The words hit her harder than she expected. There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment, just a tired honesty that made her heart ache. Inside the building, the warmth wrapped around them instantly. Talon paused in the doorway to wipe his boots on the rug, almost apologetically, as though he didn't want to bring even a speck of dirt into her space. Ella noticed the small things, how he kept his arms close to his body, how he looked around as if memorizing the path to the stairs, how he moved like someone who had learned to avoid getting in anyone's way. When they reached her second-floor apartment, she unlocked the door and stepped aside to let him enter first. But he hesitated. "You go," he murmured. "It's your home." She smiled softly. "You're my guest, Talon." The word guest seemed to unsettle him, but he nodded and stepped inside. And just like that, her small apartment, usually quiet, predictable, felt suddenly alive, with the presence of someone who carried a whole hidden world inside him. Talon's eyes moved over the room slowly. He didn't stare. He observed. The books stacked unevenly along the shelves, the small plant on the window ledge, the coat draped over the back of the couch. Everything seemed to matter to him, as though he was trying to understand what kind of person she was based on what she surrounded herself with. "You live alone?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Always have." He didn't respond, but she felt the weight of the words he didn't say. Same. Ella motioned toward the table. "Let me get you something warm." While she warmed soup on the stove, she listened to the quiet behind her. Talon wasn't the type to fill silence. He wasn't restless either. He sat at the table with a stillness that wasn't boredom, it was awareness. He sat like someone who noticed every sound, every shift of the building, every detail, and she began to realize something. His calmness wasn't passive. It was strength, shaped by hardship. She set the bowl of soup in front of him, and for the first time since she had met him, Talon looked startled. Not by the food, but by her gesture. It was as if kindness was something rare enough to unsettle him. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly when he struggled to find words, but he shook his head slowly. "I do." He lifted the spoon, and she watched the tension in his shoulders ease just a little as the warmth settled into him. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the edge of the napkin she provided, then looked up at her with a steadiness that made her breath catch. "You didn't have to stop for me," he said. "People don't. Usually." She sat across from him, folding her hands together. "Maybe I didn't have to, but I wanted to." Something flickered in his eyes, something guarded, something aching. "You asked my name earlier," he said quietly. "Talon," she repeated. He nodded. "It's one of the only things I still have." The words were soft, but they carried a depth that made her chest tighten. A person didn't say something like that unless life had stripped everything else away. Ella leaned forward slightly. Well, now someone else knows it. And it matters to me. Talon's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Not out of discomfort, but out of emotion he wasn't ready to share. For the first time. She realized just how heavy his loneliness must be, and he realized for the first time in years that someone actually cared enough to see him. The moment Talon stepped deeper into her apartment, Ella saw something shift in him. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden smile, no visible sigh of relief, but a subtler, quieter softening. As though some invisible weight he always carried loosened by a fraction just from being indoors, in warmth, in safety. Ella hung her coat by the door while Talon stood near the entryway, not moving farther until she gestured him in. It struck her again how carefully he navigated her space, like someone who had spent a long time making himself smaller for the world. Not because he was weak, but because life had taught him that taking up space came with consequences. Make yourself comfortable, she said gently. Motioning toward the couch, Talon nodded but didn't sit immediately. Instead, he scanned the room with slow, intent eyes the way someone might study a place they weren't sure they belonged in. Ella wondered what he saw. Her small, lived-in home with its mismatched cushions, overflowing bookshelf and blanket draped over the arm of the sofa. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fancy. But it was hers. She watched him for a moment, noticing little details she hadn't before. His posture upright and alert, like he was always ready to respond to something unseen. The way he kept his hands tucked near his sides, as if he didn't want to risk knocking anything over. And the way he almost seemed to melt into silence, not because he lacked something to say, but because he was listening. He sat only when she sat first. Ella gave a small smile. You know, you don't have to be so formal. He blinked slowly, as though he needed a moment to understand what she meant. I'm not used to being invited in, he admitted after a pause. Most doors don't open for me. There was no bitterness in his tone, which somehow made it hurt even more. He said it like he was simply stating a fact, something long accepted. Well, she murmured, this one is open. You don't have to tiptoe. He looked down, and she worried she'd said the wrong thing. But then a faint, almost shy smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the smallest flicker of warmth. Like a spark in cold air. I'll try, he said quietly. Ella noticed the exhaustion in his face now that the shadows of the street weren't hiding it. The hollow beneath his cheekbones, the slight redness around his eyes, the rough dryness of his hands. She wondered how long he had been drifting, sleeping wherever he could, keeping one ear open for danger. I can make tea if you'd like, she offered. He nodded once. If it's not too much trouble. It's not, she said, and headed toward the small kitchen. While the water heated, she could feel his presence behind her, silent but not heavy. She glanced over her shoulder. Talon wasn't rummaging through her things or fidgeting. Instead, he sat quietly, hands folded loosely, eyes drifting across the room with something between curiosity and disbelief. You have a lot of books, he said at last, voice gentle. Ella grinned. It's an addiction. The good kind. He nodded slowly. My grandmother used to say stories are medicine. Ella paused with the teacup in her hand. That's beautiful. He didn't elaborate. Didn't explain. But the way he said it, with reverence, with memory, made her heart warm. She brought him a cup of tea and sat across from him again. He wrapped his hands around the cup like it was a treasure, inhaling the steam before taking a slow sip. She watched the tension in his jaw release just a little. He leaned back slightly, not quite relaxed but less tightly wound. This place, he said softly, eyes wandering. It's peaceful. Ella didn't think much of her apartment. Some days it felt too small, too quiet. But hearing the word peaceful come from someone like him, someone who carried storms beneath his calm surface, made it feel different. as if she'd never appreciated her own home properly until now. "I'm glad you think so," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "It's been a long time since I've felt safe." Those words landed like a stone in her chest. She didn't ask him why. She didn't pry. She simply placed her cup down and said, in a voice that came softer than she intended, "You're safe here, Talon." His eyes lifted to hers, slow, cautious, searching. And in that moment, Ella realized just how deeply loneliness had carved itself into him. How foreign it must feel for him to sit in a warm room where someone actually cared whether he stayed or went. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The way he held her gaze steady, almost grateful, said enough. And for the first time that night, she wondered if bringing him home hadn't been a moment of impulsive compassion. But something far more faded. The apartment had grown quieter, not because of the absence of sound, but because of the weight of unspoken truths. Ella sat on the couch, sipping her tea, watching Talon as he traced the rim of his cup with a finger. The faint steam curled around his face, highlighting the sharp angles and lines that spoke of years harder than most could imagine. There was something about him that made her want to reach out, but she didn't know how or if he would allow it. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cautious. "I didn't come here because I needed help." Ella blinked, unsure how to respond. His words weren't defensive or proud, they were simply matter of fact. He continued, not waiting for a reaction. "I came because I had nowhere else to go." She felt her chest tighten. "You don't have to explain." Her words faltered. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Talon gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm fine now. I've managed before. Alone? Alone?" Ella echoed, her voice soft, questioning. "Yes," he said, finally letting some of the weight in his voice surface. "Alone, but not without life. I've lived, survived, crafted, and learned. But sometimes life collapses faster than one can rebuild." He paused, his gaze distant as if staring into a memory too painful to voice. Ella waited patiently, sensing that he would speak in his own time. "My family?" He began slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "I lost them. My community. It's complicated. I come from Apache ancestry, but that's not something I flaunt. It's private, sacred. I thought leaving everything behind would let me disappear." He sighed, the weight of words held in silence for years finally spilling into the room. "And yet, here I am. You found me." Ella felt a lump rise in her throat. She had never known a person to carry grief and pride so quietly. There was no self-pity, only honesty. And that honesty demanded her respect, her attention. She reached out instinctively but stopped, unsure if the gesture would be welcomed. You carry a lot," she said finally. "More than most people ever see." He gave a faint smile, almost bitter, almost embarrassed. "I've had to carry it myself for so long. I didn't expect anyone to notice." His eyes flicked toward her, lingering just long enough for her to feel the depth of something profound, a mix of vulnerability and strength that few ever allowed anyone to witness. Ella took a breath. "I notice. And I want to help. Not to change who you are. Just to give you a place where you can rest." The corner of his mouth twitched as he shook his head slightly. "I've been careful not to let anyone in. Letting someone see this side. It's dangerous. For me." "For them? Dangerous?" she asked softly. "Yes," he admitted. "Because once you see someone's scars, their history, their hidden battles, you see the truth. And sometimes people can't accept it." Ella moved slightly closer, careful not to invade his space, but close enough that he could sense her warmth. "I can accept it. I want to. You don't have to hide." For a long moment, Talon said nothing. Then he leaned back, exhaling slowly. The tension in his body softened imperceptibly. "It's rare," he said quietly, "for someone to say that without fear." Ella smiled, though her heart ached at the vulnerability she saw. "I don't fear you, Talon. I just care." The words lingered between them, soft yet heavy. Talon's eyes lowered to his hands, fingers tracing the edge of the cup once more. Then, almost imperceptibly, he looked back at her, a flicker of gratitude and something deeper passing through his gaze. "I didn't come expecting this," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost ashamed. "I didn't expect someone to see me and not judge me, to just let me be." Ella's heart ached at the quiet fragility behind his strength. "You don't have to expect it. You just have to accept it." A silence settled again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding. Talon had come to her as a stranger, a man carrying the weight of lost family, lost community, and solitude. And now he was learning, slowly, that trust and connection weren't weaknesses, they could be lifelines. For the first time in years, Talon didn't feel the crushing weight of being unseen. And Ella realized as she watched him that she hadn't just offered food and warmth, she had given him the beginnings of a place where he could finally belong. The days that followed Talon's arrival unfolded quietly at first, each one layered with subtle gestures that neither of them fully understood. Ella watched him move through her apartment with careful attention, noticing the way he lingered near the window when sunlight spilled in, how he traced the lines of the furniture as if memorizing them, how he made small adjustments to the cushions or shelves, not because they needed it, but because it felt like a way to belong. She, in turn, began to notice things she hadn't before, the way his presence filled the air without speaking, the quiet way he moved in rhythm with her, the small smile that occasionally appeared when he thought no one was looking. Talon had been a stranger, a man who carried grief and solitude like armor. Yet here he was, slowly unraveling it, and it unsettled her in ways she didn't expect. It was a rainy evening, one that mirrored the first night she had found him, that finally shifted the balance between them. Ella had been reading by the lamp in the living room while Talon sat nearby, silently sketching in a small notebook she had noticed he carried. The room was thick with the kind of quiet that makes your own heart beat loud. The storm outside was a low hum, a companion to the electricity that hummed softly in the space between them. Talon's gaze lifted from his sketching, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, he looked directly at her. His eyes were dark, fathomless, carrying all the storms he had endured, all the distance he had walked to arrive here, and the vulnerability of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. Ella felt her breath catch. The air between them seemed suddenly charged, each heartbeat stretching out, amplifying the awareness of each other. She shifted slightly in her chair, reaching for her mug of tea, and their hands brushed. The contact was accidental, fleeting, yet it felt monumental. Talon didn't pull away. Instead, he held her gaze, and she could see in him the same astonishment she felt in herself. It wasn't desire in the shallow sense, not yet. It was recognition, two worlds colliding with the force of unspoken understanding. He saw her in a way no one else ever had, and she saw him. Not just the shell of a man who had been homeless, but the soul beneath, the quiet strength, the pain, the history, and the tenderness that he kept hidden even from himself. "You're different," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He inclined his head, thoughtful. "Different from what I expected," he admitted. "Different from what I've allowed myself to expect from anyone." Her chest tightened at the confession, at the raw honesty. There was a gravity to his presence that drew her in, a stillness that demanded attention, a truth that left no room for pretense. She realized then that Talon's walls were high because he had learned to protect himself from disappointment, from rejection, from the world itself. And yet, here he was, letting the smallest crack appear. "I'm glad you stayed," she murmured, almost more to herself than to him. He tilted his head slightly, the faintest smile brushing his lips. "I didn't expect this either." The moment hung suspended between them, delicate and profound. A few more minutes passed in silence, but neither moved. Then, slowly, instinctively, Ella reached out again, brushing a loose strand of hair from his face. Talon's eyes closed for a heartbeat at the contact, and when he opened them again, they were darker, more luminous. Filled with something that went beyond gratitude. It was the beginning of trust, fragile yet undeniable. The moment their worlds tilted wasn't marked by grand gestures or declarations, but by the quiet, electric understanding that neither of them had anticipated, yet both had been silently waiting for the first time in a long time. Talon felt seen, not as a shadow, not as a man without a place, but as someone who could matter, who could be wanted, who could be more than the life he had fled. And Ella felt it too, the pull of something dangerous in its intensity, yet tender in its sincerity. She realized that by inviting him into her apartment, she hadn't just offered shelter. She had offered the possibility of connection, of vulnerability, of a shared heartbeat between two people who had wandered too long alone. In that quiet evening light, with rain pattering against the windows, Talon and Ella found the first hint of a bridge between their lives, one built not of need or obligation, but of recognition, trust, and a fragile, growing affection that neither could yet name. The days after that stormy evening were quieter, but the tension between them grew in a subtler, almost unspoken way. Talon moved through the apartment with more ease now, though he remained cautious. He didn't occupy space recklessly, yet his presence was undeniably stronger, like the calm before a storm, or the gravity of someone who had finally stopped running. Ella noticed small changes in him, how he lingered longer at the window in the morning, how he handled her belongings with care, how he allowed himself moments of comfort instead of retreating immediately. She saw him smiling when she wasn't watching, a small, private expression of something he hadn't felt in years. Contentment. It was late one evening when he finally spoke, in a voice softer than usual. Ella had been reading on the couch, a blanket tucked around her shoulders, when she heard him say her name. "Ella, can I tell you something?" She set the book aside and gave him her full attention. "Of course." He paused, hands wrapped around his own cup, gaze fixed on the swirling tea as if drawing courage from its warmth. I've been on the streets a long time. Not just physically, but inside, in every sense. People forget you exist, and even when they notice, they don't care. I didn't expect anyone to." His voice faltered slightly, then steadied. "To care for me. Not really. Not enough to see who I am beneath the surface." Ella's heart thumped at the honesty in his words. "You're not invisible to me," she said softly. "I see you, Talon, all of you." He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting her eyes. For a moment, she saw something she hadn't yet fully grasped, the raw intensity of someone who had survived alone, who had built walls high enough to keep out the world, yet still longed for connection. He inhaled sharply, as though tasting her words and letting them sink into a part of himself he had long denied. "Once I tasted what kindness feels like," he murmured, almost to himself. "I didn't know how to stop wanting more." Ella felt a jolt in her chest. It wasn't a casual confession, it was a revelation. He wasn't speaking of romance yet, not exactly, but of the fundamental human need he had been starving for: warmth, care, acknowledgement. A life where he could be seen without judgment, without pretense. She reached out, lightly placing a hand over his. He flinched initially, then allowed the contact, his fingers brushing hers hesitantly. The touch was electric, grounding, and for a heartbeat, Both of them simply existed in the quiet hum of the apartment. No words were needed. The connection had already been made. I didn't expect anyone to notice me, he continued after a moment, voice low and measured. I've lived years thinking I had to survive alone. I thought that was strength. But maybe, he hesitated, then looked at her fully. Maybe strength isn't surviving alone. Maybe it's allowing someone to stay. Ella's throat tightened. She had known he carried pain, but hearing it, feeling the depth of his loneliness, made her realize how much he had sacrificed and endured. You don't have to do it alone anymore, she whispered. You don't have to survive alone. Not here. Not with me. Talon's gaze softened, and a faint, almost shy smile curved his lips. For the first time, he seemed to lower the walls he had built so carefully over the years. There was vulnerability there, yes, but also something stronger, trust. He was offering her a part of himself he hadn't shared in years, maybe decades. I don't know how to be this, he admitted, voice barely audible. To allow someone in. You'll learn, she said, her own voice gentle but firm. Step by step. I'll be here. He nodded slowly, a weight lifting subtly from his shoulders. The tension in his body softened as he leaned back slightly, still cautious but less guarded. He was beginning to understand that kindness wasn't weakness, and that vulnerability didn't have to be a trap. And in that quiet, candlelit apartment, something shifted profoundly. Talon didn't just feel seen. He felt understood, appreciated, and quietly cherished. And Ella realized that she hadn't just invited a stranger into her home. She had invited a soul, wounded and hidden, into hers, and in return, she was discovering the unspoken magic of healing together. That night, as rain whispered against the windows, both of them felt the beginnings of something tender and irrevocable, trust, connection, and the fragile yet undeniable stirrings of love. The apartment felt different that night, though nothing about the space itself had changed. The same furniture, the same books, the same faint scent of tea and rain lingering in the air, but something between them had shifted. Talon sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders slightly forward, hands resting lightly on his knees. Ella sat opposite him, blanket draped around her, noticing how his presence filled the room in a way that was almost tangible. They hadn't spoken much, yet neither felt the need to. The silence was not awkward, it was intimate, charged with unspoken acknowledgement of what had been growing quietly between them. Every glance, every slight movement carried weight. Talon's dark eyes lingered on her longer than they used to, and she caught herself unconsciously meeting his gaze. Her own heartbeat quickening each time. Ella broke the quiet first, her voice soft. You've been here for a while now. Talon tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Not very long, but long enough to notice how much you care. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. I care because I see you, Talon, all of you. You don't have to hide. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. I've spent so long thinking I had to keep everything inside. That showing weakness was dangerous. Vulnerability isn't weakness, she said gently. It's the only way to be truly seen. He looked at her then, fully, without turning away. There was a gravity to his gaze that made her pulse skip. In his eyes, she saw years of solitude, of careful distance, of survival that had never allowed room for closeness. And yet, here he was, letting her in not just physically, but emotionally. The air shifted again when Talon moved closer, settling on the couch at a distance that was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him, yet far enough to maintain his careful boundaries. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain tapping against the window in a steady rhythm that mirrored the rapid beating of her heart. She noticed the small gestures he made adjusting a cushion, tucking his fingers beneath him, each one deliberate, each one quietly anchoring himself in her space. "You're different from everyone I've ever met," he said, voice low and measured. "Not because of anything extraordinary you do, but because you make it safe to be seen, even when I'm not sure I deserve it." Ella felt a lump rise in her throat. "You deserve it, Talon, more than you know." For the first time that evening, their hands brushed deliberately, not accidentally. Neither pulled away. The touch was electric, sending a ripple through them both. Talon's fingers were long, calloused from a life of labor and survival, yet gentle as they traced hers lightly. He looked at her then, his eyes dark, almost luminous, with a depth of feeling that startled her. "I don't know if I've ever wanted someone like this before," he admitted, voice barely a whisper. "Someone who sees me, really sees me, and still stays." "You don't have to know how to do it," Ella replied. "You just have to let it happen." And in that simple admission, the walls he had built for years began to crumble, not all at once, but in small, deliberate pieces. He leaned slightly closer, his presence warm and steady. She met him halfway, leaning in just enough that their shoulders touched. The faintest brush that made both of them aware of how much the other mattered. Time seemed to stretch in that quiet apartment, marked only by the soft patter of rain and the steady rhythm of hearts discovering one another. Talon had come to her with the weight of the streets on his shoulders, carrying grief, solitude, and hidden histories. And now, as he sat there, close, open, and unguarded, he felt something new: belonging, trust, and the unmistakable stirrings of desire intertwined with care. Ella realized, as she watched him, that he wasn't just a man she had helped. He was becoming the center of her world in ways she hadn't anticipated. And Talon, feeling the warmth and acceptance he had long denied himself, understood that this night-quiet ordinary, yet profound, might change everything he had ever believed about himself and the life he could allow himself to have. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside, a rush of emotion, longing, and anticipation that neither could yet name. But both knew, instinctively, that something irreversible had begun, and neither would ever be the same. The days after that night unfolded with a quiet, unspoken rhythm, as if the universe had shifted subtly for both of them. Talon moved through Ella's apartment with a newfound ease, still cautious, still deliberate, but no longer like a shadow trying not to be noticed. He laughed quietly at the little things, her clumsy attempts at cooking, the cat that had appeared at her door weeks before, the way the sunlight danced across the bookshelves. Those small, ordinary moments seemed extraordinary in his eyes, and Ella couldn't help but smile at the wonder he found in simple things. Evenings became their own kind of sanctuary. They would sit together on the couch, cups of tea in hand, the room filled with the soft hum of conversation, punctuated by comfortable silences. The stormy nights of their first meeting were long behind them, but the memory of that night lingered like a heartbeat beneath everything. It reminded them of how fragile trust and connection could be, and how powerful it was when it finally arrived. Talon had begun to open more, revealing the depths of himself without fear. He spoke of his heritage with reverence, sharing stories his grandmother had told him about the Apache lands, about survival and honor, about strength that came from compassion as much as from courage. Ella listened with rapt attention, absorbing not just the words but the spirit behind them. She realized that what she had initially thought was simply kindness had awakened something in him, a man who had long believed that no one could see him, now fully seen and accepted. One night, after a long day that had blurred into evening, Talon quietly shifted on the couch until he was sitting closer to her than usual. His arm brushed against hers, hesitantly, as if testing the waters. Ella didn't move away. Instead, she leaned just slightly into him, and the warmth that spread through them was both comforting and intoxicating, "I never thought I could feel like this again," he said softly, voice low, almost reverent. "Like someone could want me. All of me." Ella reached for his hand, letting her fingers intertwine with his. "You've always been worthy of being wanted," she said. "You just had to find the place where it was safe to belong." He swallowed, emotion flickering across his face. "I thought I was meant to wander forever, to carry everything alone. But you've given me a home. Not just a physical home," Ella realized, but a place in someone's heart, a sanctuary where he could finally lay down the burdens he had carried for so long. She squeezed his hand gently, feeling the quiet strength in him, and the vulnerability that he now allowed her to witness. They sat together for a long while, the room dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp. Rain tapped gently against the window, but inside, the atmosphere was warm, intimate, and electric with the connection that had grown between them. Talon rested his head lightly against her shoulder, and Ella leaned her head against his, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, the steady rhythm of his heart. In that moment, all the fears and doubts of the past seemed to vanish, replaced by trust, acceptance, and a profound sense of belonging. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured, voice barely audible. "This quiet, this peace, this love." Ella tilted her head so that her lips brushed his temple, a small, tender gesture of affection. "You deserve it, Talon, more than you realize." He closed his eyes, letting the words sink in, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to fully feel safe, cherished, and wanted. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long melted away, replaced by a new reality he had scarcely imagined. He had found a place where he could be himself completely, without pretense, without fear. And in turn, Ella realized that she too had been changed. Talon's presence had shifted something deep within her, an understanding that love was not just about passion, but about acceptance, patience, and seeing the fullness of another person. That night, as the storm outside faded into a gentle drizzle, Talon and Ella didn't just share space. They shared hearts. And in that shared space, they built a home neither had expected, but both had needed desperately. A home not defined by walls or a roof, but by trust, tenderness, and the undeniable knowledge that they belonged together. Talon, the man who had once wandered streets alone and invisible, finally understood the meaning of being seen, being wanted, being loved. And Ella, who had opened her door on a rainy night out of instinctive kindness, had discovered a love that filled her world completely. In the end, it wasn't just shelter he had found, it was a life, a home and a heart that would hold him always.